European Union to Israel. I would like to begin and keep to our schedule. People will probably join us more later in the coming minutes. So dear friends, colleagues, and guests, my name is Sion-Tzidkiyahu, and I'll moderate this Zoom on the European Parliament elections and their influence on Israel. Before we get to Israel, we have a few other stations to cover. So there was, as I said, a great interest in the elections results and much more media coverage in Israel than in 2019. And indeed, this year's the implication of the elections on the EU and on some member states are considerable. So before I introduce the concept of the Zoom, let me note that this Zoom is recorded and will be uploaded to Mitvim and the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration's YouTube channel. So if you do not wish so, feel free to shut down your camera, and please do keep yourself on the mute mode until we reach the questions part at the end. We also wish to summarize the main points of the event, and for that we will use an AI summary. The aim is to have just a general short summary and not to refer to specific person. So I hope that is okay with everybody, also the one who will ask questions. We have three great speakers, and I'll note that Mr. Julian Barnes-Tassi, who was supposed to speak today, unfortunately had to cancel a few days ago. He sends his apologies. We are very fortunate to have with us Mr. Matthijs Schüssler, and I know he'll be a significant added value to analyze all the questions we'll deal with soon. So thank you, Matthijs, for joining us on such a short notice.
Pleasure.
In the next hour, we'll have 3 rounds of questions to discuss between the speakers, whom I'll introduce shortly. And then we'll open for Q&A. We'll go on from the bigger European scale to the common foreign and security policy arena, and then to the effect on Israel and the war in Gaza. And when I will open for Q&A on the last part, please use the raise hand button that you have in the menu of the Zoom. So before I introduce our speakers, I would first like to thank the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration for their cooperation in holding this event, and to thank the Mitvim Institute team, and especially Rif Yitzhaki for organizing it. And for you, dear colleagues, for your interest. And last but certainly not least, I wish to thank our partner, the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung Foundation. Pleased to first give the floor to a short opening remarks by Dr. Ralf Meltzer, who is the head of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung office in Israel. Dr. Meltzer came to Israel after heading the regional Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung office for Southeast Europe, and beforehand from the office in Tunis. So please, Dr. Meltzer, your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Maya, for your introduction, and a warm welcome from my side as well to all of you. FES Israel is pleased to co-host this Zoom seminar today, which takes place in a time when both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia increased significantly in Europe. The recent elections to the European Parliament took place in a highly polarized and emotionalized atmosphere. And I think in this situation, it is important to analyze the results and the potential impact both on Israel, and I think that's also on the agenda to also discuss the potential impact on the situation in Ukraine and on Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Throughout Europe, we are confronted with rising far-right political parties and movements, and the relative strength in the new parliament is not yet entirely clear, because currently around 100 elected parliament members are not assigned to any parliamentary group. But from a German perspective, I can say, however, that the most disturbing result is definitely the success of the far-right party AfD, that became the second strongest party in Germany in these European elections. At the same time, strong anti-Israel sentiments are expressed within the progressive camp, while populists utilize the Gaza war for their political purposes. Just today, Haaretz covered how anti-Semitism became one of the key issues in the snap French election. So the October 7th terror attack by Hamas and subsequent war in Gaza have without any doubt reshuffled the EU-Israel relations. In other words, there's a lot to be discussed. So thank you very much to all of you for joining us today online at this event. And thanks a lot in particular to our partners and to our speakers today. And with that, I'm now very much looking forward to our debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Meltzer. I definitely agree that the EU electorate is polarized. With this, before the first round, I want to introduce our speakers. Despite, let me say, being Israelis, two of them are on the French and German axis, and the third one is from the Netherlands, but lives in Brussels. So this is an interesting combination to discuss the European Parliament result. Ms. Rina Bassist is the head of the Israeli post at Monitor. She is a journalist who lives, as I said, in Paris, and a policy fellow at Mitvim. She has been serving for many years as international correspondent for Israeli Public Broadcasting Authority, stationed in Paris and in Brussels. And she also had a career as a diplomat beforehand. Mr. Assaf is the European correspondent of Globes, and he lives in Berlin and also in Jaffa. And he is a PhD candidate at the European Forum at the Hebrew University. He covers, to a great deal, one of the main, I think, reporters who cover EU issues in Israel. And last but not least, Matthijs Schüssler is the Chief Executive Officer of ELNET-EU and NATO office. ELNET is a leading NGO dedicated to strengthening Europe-Israel relations based on shared democratic values and strategic interests. It has offices in 6 European countries, and if anyone feels the Israeli-EU pulse, it's the ELNET office in Brussels. So thank you so much for joining and being willing to talk to us about those issues. And as I've said, we have 3 rounds of questions, and the first one is the most general one, trying to capture the mode of the results of the elections and the state of the European Union after those, when we analyze those results. So what I wish to hear from you, Rina, Assaf, and Matthijs, is your analysis on the results. How do you think they will change the European Union's position, be it in different policies, or we'll address later the common foreign security policy, and from there we'll move to Israel and the war in Gaza. And there is a long list of fields which may be affected. We can list, immigration, the Green Deal, rule of law, the war in Ukraine was mentioned already, and obviously the war in Gaza. So I want us first to have a general look at the results and try to analyze them. I know that from my perspective, there are at least 2 cuts under which we can analyze those results, one from the EU level and one from the member state level, and I'm sure you'll provide us with both. So we'll go in a different order in each round. Assaf, can we begin with you?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much, everybody who's participating. It's very interesting topics. I've been covering Europe for Israeli audiences since 2006, Haaretz in London, and I'm very happy to see Europe is starting, or maybe progressing to be very central on the Israeli agenda. I would like perhaps to take one to frame, so to say, the results in one judgmental aspect. And this is, I think they present a failure, like you've said, like many others have said, a failure of governments to deal with the issue of illegal immigration. And I think we see very clear strengthening of right-wing populist groups who are against illegal immigration. In Germany here, we see even the rise of the left radical alliance, which is against the asylum system as it is, which means there is a common ground which in the European public, at least, let's say Germany, France, Italy, Spain, which is unhappy with the way things go. And you can say, okay, they're unhappy, but you can say also this is a failure of the mainstream political parties, from the conservatives or the social democrats, to deal with this issue, which is quite clearly a very important topic, and which has been on the European agenda on and off. I mean, in 2015, we had more than 1.5 million illegal immigrants, so to say, coming into Europe, majority to Germany. And since then, because of Corona and so on, the numbers went down. What we see now is that 2023 was the first year that the threshold of 1 million asylum applications was again mentioned. And so we see again the rise in this anti-illegal immigration sentiment. And I just want to stress the point that I think this is a failure because other parties, let's say, let's look at the Social Democrats in Denmark, who adopted a very strict anti-asylum policy. There, the right wing and the issue of illegal immigration in this election was also not so present. While in Germany, this subject led to a fact that AfD, a party whose head for the elections said that not all SS members were criminals, got such a high percentage and is leading in the east of Germany. It became almost a Volkspartei, a People's Party in Germany. And the danger of this failure is not so much in the ideas of the right wing going into the mainstream. The danger is that the right wing will assume positions of power through these populist ideas, and through that increase or inject into the democratic systems elements which are not democratic. I mean, Israel is the best example of this, but this is a danger in Germany, this is a danger in France, this is a danger in Spain, and we see this, I see this as something that the European public is kind of screaming about, and the main political parties are closing their ears or just saying things in order to please, and not really reversing a policy which the public seems to be unhappy about. So my main takeaway is the overall, because I'm talking from Germany, there are 27 other countries and I cannot talk about them all, but if there is one trend, I would say that there is a wish to tackle illegal immigration in a much better way.
The war in Ukraine, to some extent, is much more occupying, should I say, the minds of Central and Eastern European countries rather than very southern and Western ones. Some Western and Southern ones. So yeah, I agree with you. So definitely we see a failure to react, and we've seen also today in the news some really, how Europe is being in conflict, how to deal with those immigrations. There was an article in Haaretz about the Greek coast guards and what happened over there with 43, at least, immigrants being reported, pushed back and killed. Yeah. Yeah,
I think you can hear me now. Just to add one key point, Europe is a continent in financial crisis, in economic crisis. And the fact that the interest rates, the inflation has been here, I don't know, in Germany, 20% up in the last 3 years, in other countries also, makes people very much worried about their future, about their money, and they don't feel they can subsidize issues like illegal immigration or the Green New Deal. So that's another point that I wanted to add in relation to this outcome.
Definitely, those are two topics that we knew from history also that are caused to the rise of right-wing extreme parties and populist ones. Thank you, Assaf. Rina, we'll go to you.
Yes, I will go back maybe to something that Assaf said, which was, I think, very important, that he was talking about. In different countries, we all have this subject of anti-immigration and stopping immigration and so on as a common denominator. And it's interesting because we entered these elections into a contradictory situation, because on the one hand, of course, the pro-European leaders over the years are trying to strengthen the European institutions, including, of course, the European Parliament. And we know that over the years, these elections to the European Parliament, the public was not very interested, and the rating of the vote is rather low. We are at 51%. And here we are in a contradictory situation where these Eurosceptic parties who are looking to advance the issue of anti-immigration on a national level, they are the ones entering the race with all their force. They are the ones campaigning much more maybe than the other parties. So it's this issue of strengthening the European institution has become, in a way, a double-edged sword. And we saw that in France, we saw that in Belgium, we saw that even in Greece, because the moment you say that these elections matter, that the European Parliament matters, then of course also the consequences matter. And that is why in France it came in the form of, I think everybody here on the Zoom heard President Emmanuel Macron announcing the dissolution of the French Parliament and new elections to be held on June 30 and then on July 7. And we saw it in Belgium also, with the Prime Minister resigning, and the poor Belgians again will have to go into elections. And we saw it even in Greece with the reshuffling of the government. So even beyond this subject, the specific subject of the anti-immigration or the issue of the Green Deal, all of these issues that people were voting on, there is also this issue of the skeptic Eurosceptic parties using, and this is new, I think, using the European institution, using the European tools to advance an agenda that is in fact anti-liberal, anti-European, etc., etc. And I want also to a few words, if I may, also on the results, because there have been a lot of articles in Israel. The far right have won, and it's not as simple as that, of course, because the first winners are the center right, not the far right. But still, this trend of strengthening of the far right, I think President Macron was very right to look at it and to take it as a lesson, as a dangerous lesson, because what we are talking about is not just the numbers. We're talking about a phenomena where the far right parties, and this is also especially evident in France, I think, are becoming legitimate. And these parties, and we saw it very clearly this election, they are no longer niche parties. They are main parties. They are parties that could govern. Of course, we see it in Italy. Maybe we'll see it in a couple of weeks also in France. So I would take that as the first lesson of these elections, the change in status of these far right parties.
Indeed, Rina, I agree with you that this year in particular, those elections have been quite, shattering in some states. And I don't remember such a phenomenon in the past. Usually in the UK, they had some implications within the Conservatives between Margaret Thatcher and others, but it didn't happen the same way that it did as a cause of European Parliament elections. So we definitely see how those elections are reverberating in the member states, and they're going to reverberate back again to the EU once we have the results of the French elections. Indeed. So, Matti, what is your perspective on the results? I mean, Rina was saying, and to some extent I agree with you, that it's not all as Israelis media like to describe, that the European extreme right and populists have completely won. And the picture is indeed more complex. And as Ralph mentioned at the beginning, we do see 100 members of European Parliament who are others. And I wonder whether if you have any prospects also to tell us in the next week or 2 weeks, when they form the political groups in the European Parliament, will we see different results than what we've seen when the results were published? Please.
Yeah, so no, excellent question. I think, all the predictions before the elections that took place between the 6th and the 9th of June, they were pointing in the direction that there would be a significant rise on the right side of the parliament. I think it depends a little bit who you ask, whether this rise was very high or a bit lower, but what it means concretely for the situation that we are in right now is that the coalition that we had in the past 5 years, meaning the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the Liberals, Renew Europe, that they still have a majority in the parliament to continue with this coalition. And it's, I think, interesting to mention that in 2014 they had 77% of the votes in the parliament. Right now they're down to 56, which in some countries still might be a lot, but for European Parliament, this is really a significant change. So I think in that way we will see a continuation of policies that we have seen in the past. But as Assaf also already mentioned, many parties, and especially the Christian Democratic Party, who is the largest party still after this election, has started to incorporate more and more right-wing ideas. When it comes to immigration, when it comes to climate, we had huge demonstrations with farmers all across the EU. I mean, Germany, France, the Netherlands, many more countries. So the Green Deal will definitely be affected by that. The topic of deregulation, I think, and that brings me to the next part. Many of those far right or extreme right parties have also started to walk back some of their extreme policies. So, for example, Marine Le Pen, but also a party like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, they now no longer want to exit the EU, to have a Brexit, but they want to change the EU from within. So there are some significant changes also when it comes to Russia. We'll get to that later, but you see that many of them are becoming somewhat more moderate. Geert Wilders now in the Netherlands speaking about not all Muslims, but extreme Muslims. Well, it's a very different tone that we know from the past. So it's interesting to see how that will develop. And then just a last point, all of this is connected. So as Rina already mentioned, in France, there is this battle between Macron and Le Pen, which directly now affects national politics. But also with the AfD in Germany that was kicked out of one of the European parties called Identity and Democracy, it's really interesting to see how those far and extreme right parties will reorganize, and if they will reorganize on the right side of the European Parliament to make themselves more salonfähig, to say it in good German, acceptable for also parties like the EPP to work with, because the European Parliament democracy is interesting in the sense that the Parliament cannot send the government home, so to say. So the Parliament has, because of this particular political powers, they are more flexible in the way they build coalitions. So the traditional coalition will remain, but the EPP especially will have the possibility on certain topics that they also believe for their own political gain are important. They will have an increased possibility now to work and make new coalitions on the right. Whereas in the past that was more difficult because the SD and especially Renew Europe, the Liberal Party, were much bigger. So they were able to block certain policies, or at least make the majority vote very difficult and uncertain until the end.
Thank you, Matthijs. Really interesting. So on the one side, we see that the policies of the EU in the last year have gone a little bit to the right in extent to immigration, to the deal of immigration, and with regards to lessening, the effects of the Green Deal because of farmers' demonstrations and etc. And on the other side, you say that the European right, maybe hard right or populist or extreme right is being, some of them are being moderated. So to some extent, they're coming together. Wonderful. So we're going to the next second round, and what we want to do here in this round, maybe to have it a bit short, to look specifically on the effects of the result on the EU common foreign and security policy. So we're going to have the new High Representative for Common Foreign and Security Policy, perhaps being even named today after the dinner today of the European Council leaders. And we're going to have, we have the war in Ukraine that is going on, and obviously the war in Gaza, in which we can touch on the third round. So how do you see the effects? I mean, I know that the Parliament itself doesn't have really a direct effect on the common foreign and security policy, but how do you see, that sign of Europe is moving to the right? How do you see that affect the common foreign and security policy of the EU? And we'll go maybe in reverse order. And Matti, would you please be first?
Yeah, thanks. So if I may, I will just make one more comment that also relates to the first topic, and it relates actually to what you mentioned. So the EU leaders are right now gathering here in Europe to discuss the next top positions, which is always a big negotiation between the EU parties, but also between the member states, because usually the position of von der Leyen goes to one of the bigger countries. And mentioning von der Leyen, when you're looking at those deals that are being made, most probably von der Leyen will need a very strong support of Meloni to secure her next position. So today there was an article in Politico about a certain discussion that has risen in Italy about the freedom of media, and the suggestion that von der Leyen is now willing to push this a little bit, kick the ball of a possible investigation down the road, because she needs Meloni's support to secure her own position for the next 5 years. So I think this is just a very concrete example of what we are talking about. What Assaf and Rina also mentioned. Then looking at the position, so Ursula von der Leyen is most likely to be re-elected as the president of the European Commission, and then the High Representative, Vice President, so the chief diplomat, so to say, of the EU. The name that everyone is mentioning is Kallas from Estonia. She was also in the race to become the next NATO Secretary General, but I think that was a little bit maybe too much to have someone from the Baltic states in that position. Too sensitive also in this period in time. But I think it's an interesting nomination. I think compared to Borrell, although she is also from the Social Democratic Party, because usually how it goes is that the largest party, the Christian Democrats in this case, they get to nominate the president, and then the second largest party, they get to nominate either the High Representative or the chair of the council. So that's a bit how those jobs are being distributed. And I think we should expect from her a much tougher, maybe more realpolitik approach on several topics, especially when it comes to Russia, but also making the link to Israel. I think many Israelis, to say it diplomatically, often felt misunderstood by the comments that Borrell made. And knowing the political position of the Baltic states, I think we can expect a different tone of voice when it comes from her.
Thank you, Matti. Assaf, please.
I think the results of this election will weaken the common defense and even foreign relations policy of the EU, because the EU is now more fragmented than ever before. Unless we see some new alliances being put up, then the EU Parliament, which was elected, and the process of now choosing the representatives will show that the European Union is more divided than before. And even before, you had these symbolic roles of Borrell and von der Leyen that said, for example, about Israel, which we all know, they said completely different things. But the bottom line was that none of these things really mattered. So Europe didn't really have any power, any influence, any leverage on Israel. So I think these symbolic positions will stay symbolic. They will depend, of course, on the identity of whoever is manning them. But as strengthening, I don't see it possible in a situation like this where there is a global reordering, which is actually based on military power, and the European Union is lagging behind. So I think the outlook, so to say, in this subjects of defense and foreign relations, which are so important now in the world, are not going to be strengthened by these elections, and I think the opposite will happen.
Thank you, Assaf. I think especially when we'll see the results of the elections to the Assemblée Nationale in France, it may be another blow, perhaps, to the attitude, because Macron has been leading actually the most forceful attitude against Russia. Olaf Scholz, I have to say, takes a different, German usual approach of back in the back of the leaders to some extent. And that weakening of the French-German axis is also extremely worrying in that sense. Both of those leaders don't come good from those elections, but weak. And that is worrisome. Yeah, Rina, please. I don't know if you agree with my analysis or you want to stress other angles.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with your analysis. And I want maybe two short remarks. First of all, when you look at most of these far-right parties, and maybe the party of Mrs. Meloni, since it's a governing party, is a bit of a different case, but most of them, they don't have really a very coherent program for international relations. It's a bit of a loose-end game. So in that respect, I don't think that would change very much the way the EU looks generally at foreign affairs and international relations. But all of this, of course, is true, apart from the issue of Ukraine. And I think Ukraine, in a way, we all feel that. I think all those people who live in Europe, it's no longer foreign affairs or international issue. It's in our backyard. It's almost an internal issue. So Ukraine is completely in a different category. And here I feel that, yes, the rise of the far-right parties is expected to greatly affect the EU, first of all, in the parliament, but also globally in the European Union institutions. The way the European Union treats Ukraine, and you mentioned Macron, and if you go back to this, the French example, when you look, let's say, at the votes, the different votes that took place in the French Parliament on topics related to Ukraine, the party of Marine Le Pen each time either voted against or abstained. They never voted the same line as Mr. Macron and his party. And I think we all know the ties that his party had in the past with Russia, even though Marine Le Pen has tried to minimize that. Even at the last presidential election, she tried to minimize that. But she herself and her people keep saying that, of course, the aggression should not be directed towards Russia, towards President Putin, and so on. They are not going to support any move that President Macron has been pushing for a more aggressive approach, a more European global approach against Russia, or to have European soldiers, EU soldiers on Ukraine soil, and to use European weapons against Russia, etc., etc. And I think the party of Marine Le Pen is not the only one holding this line. So definitely, perhaps not on the other more distant geographically, so to say, foreign affairs issues, these elections would not affect very much, but certainly on the issue of Ukraine, I think the governments will have to take into account the results of these elections.
Interesting, I see that you want to. Yes, please.
Yeah, just to jump in on also what Assaf said. First of all, Kaja Kallas is obviously liberal and not social democrat. So just for the record, I want to correct that. But I think what Assaf said with regard to the High Representative is completely correct. I mean, there is often a lot of discussion about, how much power does this position hold? Is it only words or also deeds? I think to a certain extent, the High Representative can influence the atmosphere. He can make a lot of statements that can be very positive or harmful for certain relationships. And he or she can set the agenda also for the Foreign Affairs Council of the EU. So there is a certain influence, and Borrell last time, put the topic of the Association Council with Israel on the agenda to possibly discuss whether this Association Council should be postponed or not. So there is a certain power, but it's definitely not comparable to other foreign ministers, and I think that's also what is interesting about this, because the whole decision-making with regard to Russia, Ukraine will take place mainly between the member states of the EU. And this is where the decisions will be made. And usually they have to be taken all by unanimity. So in that sense, the parliament and the result of this election is less relevant, if I can say it like that.
That was exactly my point, that these decisions will be taken care in the national level, in the member state level, and even in NATO level, and so on, in Baltic state level, and not so much room for maneuver within the European Parliament. I don't think it will strengthen the relations between the Commission and the Parliament when it comes to supporting Ukraine, for example.
Parliament is legislative, but when it comes to foreign policy, like any parliament in the world, they don't have a lot of power other than really nominating or approving the nomination of the High Representative. But I think also what Rina was saying, that the national governments are taking into consideration the elections result when coming to Brussels. So I think to some extent you're saying the same things. I agree with you that Borrell had a very specific tone, and he was also referring to Israel and to the Gaza war on much more numerous occasions than any other conflict to some extent. Maybe even, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has become a long war, lasting war, and I think the Israeli-Gaza war has taken a lot of his time. So we've seen that, and I'm not sure that we'll see it with a different High Representative. So we're already moved into the third round of topics, and I'm wondering whether you have some more insights to say about Israel-EU relations on the bilateral connection and the trilateral unholy connection between Israel, Palestine or Palestinians, and the EU. So this, we used to be under linkage that the more the Israel and the Palestinians advance in the Middle East, in what used to be the Middle East peace process, then the EU would say that then we can advance relations with you. This is no longer the case, and Yair Lapid was able to break that linkage that didn't really work. That didn't really convince Israel to go anywhere, the Netanyahu governments to go anywhere towards the two-state solution. Saying that, also two-state solution is the agreed position of the EU, of all the 27 member states. So I'm wondering, what sense, obviously, the war in Gaza, looking into Israeli perspective, we are sure that it has a great impact. But Brussels and definitely the European Parliament elections, I'm not sure it played a significant role. We did see some states of the EU recognizing a Palestinian state just for the elections, perhaps, to gain some votes. I'm not sure it was, according to the results, it wasn't very beneficial. So what is your take on the link between not just the parliament itself, but how it will influence the EU in general and its attitude to Israel and to the war in Gaza? And we'll go in a different order. So Rina, we'll start with you.
Okay, first, if I may say, it's very interesting that during the election campaign, at least in France, when you saw all of the debates on the TV, the issue of Gaza was very present. It was brought, of course, forward by the extreme left. But then when people came out to vote, it sort of disappeared because the people from the suburbs and so on, those people that are maybe generally, and I'm characterizing, of course, more supportive of the Palestinian cause, many of them just didn't go out to vote. So we saw it as a national issue, and it's going to be also a national issue for the elections of the parliament, even though the results of the European Parliament, I don't think it was reflected or very, very little in any case. Having said that, I think there is a misconception in Israel about the Israeli far right. Of course, the far right parties are more supportive on Israel, and many of them have recognized again and again Israel's right to defend itself. But when you look at the program, and I go back to what I said earlier about this loose-end game, that their program is not, many times not going into details, but I had the occasion in the last few years to interview both Marine Le Pen and Marion Maréchal, the leaders of two extreme far-right parties in France, and both of them support the two-state solution. They don't have any other solution on the table. So this is something I think in Israel, many people maybe don't realize, that on the one hand, there are a lot of declarations, but when it will come to concrete steps, of course, the issue of the association, I think, would be less in danger if we will have, depending on the identity of the next European foreign minister and so on. And these parties are not going to endanger that agreement, but that does not mean that Israel will have a carte blanche and be able to say we're not going to negotiate ever again with the Palestinians and so on. So this is a misconception, I think, that is very important to realize. I've also spoken in the past few days with several Italian journalists, and they all say the same. It's true. Mrs. Meloni was quite quick to come to Israel to express her solidarity after October 7, but she has also been very critical of what is going on now in Gaza and specifically in Rafah. So again, we are going back to this idea that Israel is not going to have a carte blanche just because the far right in Israel, in the EU, is getting stronger.
Indeed, I couldn't agree with you more, Rina. With regards to Meloni, I didn't know about Marine Le Pen and her niece supporting the two-state solution. So, it's interesting, and I don't see the EU retreating from that position. Matthijs, do you see things otherwise?
No, I think I'll make three comments. So first of all, whether you consider the position of the European Parliament relevant or not, I think in principle the High Representative should listen to a certain extent to what the Parliament has to say. And the Parliament has really held quite a solid majority and support from Israel up until the last resolutions that were passed. Also here, there's a very good example of how that may change in the next 5 years. There was a resolution just in the new year where there was an amendment submitted that said we can only accept a ceasefire if all hostages are released. And this amendment passed by a majority of 10 votes. And now if you look at the distribution of the votes, if such an amendment would be voted on in this next parliament, most probably there will be a much larger support for such a parliament because Renew Europe, the Liberal Party, is much smaller, and parties like the European Conservative Reformists and also Identity and Democracy, two more conservative / far-right parties, usually will strongly support these kind of texts. So that's one thing regarding the European Parliament. Second thing, I think it's when you're talking about opportunities and negative developments. The EU is Israel's largest trade partner. So approximately 30% of all exports from Israel go to the EU. That's an enormous amount. From the EU to Israel, it's 1%, and it amounts to about 50 billion euros per year. It's a little bit less, but it's big numbers. Many people think it's the United States, but the EU is by far the biggest trade partner of Israel. So I think in the context of the European Union, and here the EU is extremely relevant, there are numerous programs that Israel benefits from on a large scale, like Horizon Europe, which is a huge investment program of which many universities and other research institutes receive money. But it's also about open skies, so that airplanes can fly without any problems between Israel and the EU, and there's no additional regulations. And there's many other agreements and legislation that affect this bilateral relationship, which is extremely important for Israel. I would say even more for Israel than for the EU. So that's and there's a lot more to gain there, but there is also things to lose there. So what I just mentioned is that Borrell was suggesting to suspend this association council, which and the association agreement, which basically is a kind of name that covers all the agreements between the EU and Israel. That would be a big setback for Israeli economy and Israeli universities, research programs, etc., etc. And then the third thing, when it comes to this trilateral relationship between Israel, Palestinians, and the EU, I think it's important to remember that the EU is still the largest contributor to the Palestinians when it comes to all the various programs that exist. So it's the EU and the EU member states combined, because those are different budgets. And I think that's, why Europe will have an important role to play also in the day after the war that is ongoing, just because they are able to guarantee those huge amounts of money that, in Israel, there's discussion about it. It depends a bit who you ask, but many people also believe that it's benefiting the stability in the region by EU making these funds available. So that's what I wanted to say.
Actually, we've seen a huge shift in the parliament's position towards Israel, because in the past we had a parliament that was very, I think, from the Israeli side, it was very cautious and very sometimes it wasn't sure. I mean, one of the powers of the parliament is to ratify agreements, mixed agreements between Israel and the EU. And when Open Skies had to be ratified, I think it was 2020, there was a huge effort by the Israeli diplomats to make sure that it's being ratified. So I don't see any other new agreements that Israel will sign with the EU in the really short future or even medium future. But the European Parliament eventually does have a role to play. And I definitely agree with you that Israel-EU relations on the economic and cooperation side are of strategic importance to Israel. I don't think we can say something less. So last but not least, Assaf, and then we open for questions.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention that in that case, the right wing, the right populist that won the elections is not with the same policies regarding Israel. Le Pen and Wilders are very pro-Israeli. But in Germany, we have the AfD, In Austria, we have the Freedom Party, which also won as the biggest party in Austria. Both of these parties actually said, had very, very, how I would say, not pro-Israeli positions when it comes to the war in Gaza. They called for a ceasefire even before the Greens in Western Europe called for a ceasefire because of their pro-Russian position, and they aligned themselves with Russia. So I agree with Rina and with you and with Matthijs about the fact that their foreign relation agenda is not 100% solid in a way that they can change positions. And if we saw it now with AfD and Freedom Party, perhaps we will see it with other parties. Meloni basically threw Israel under the bus after she went to the election and said, we want, our party will be like the party of the Likud. And she said Israel is a great a role model for Italy. Basically, she joined France in saying, don't go into Rafah. And her defense minister announced Italy is putting a weapons embargo on Israel voluntarily. So the right wing, either it's radical, it's populist, it's quite sure that some positions, pro-Israeli positions, I'm not sure that the celebrations in Israel about that development are justified.
Yeah, I agree with you. The picture is much more mixed than Israeli press usually present it. Are you want to add something?
Let me add one thing, just something, perhaps an insight, that the reason the European Parliament has been so supportive or not so critical of Israel so far can be a little bit attributed to the unique position Germany has with its, I don't know, overrepresentation, but it's represented very much in the European Parliament. And Germany, whether it's Social Democrats, whether it's Christian Democrats, whether it's the Greens, they all maintain a pro-Israeli approach. And I know in the Greens, the German Greens are hated among the Greens in Western Europe because they didn't approve a few anti-Israeli motions. And the same goes for all these groups. So the three main groups, or three of the four main groups, have a very strong German position in them, which kind of quietened the criticism of Israel, I think, since the war in Gaza started.
Thank you, Assaf. And indeed, I think the Greens were sort of the middle political party to make sort of mediation between the more anti-Israeli or critical of Israel camp and the pro-Israeli camp in the European Parliament. So with this, we can open for questions. Ilan, Mo, I see that you raise your hand. I want to collect a couple of questions. So I would ask you to be short and to have a question with a question mark in the end, and to start by presenting yourself. So Ilan, you'll be first, and if you'll see another raised hand, or if please assist me if you see another one. Yeah, Ilan, please.
Good evening. Thank you, Maya, for giving me the opportunity, and thank you for organizing this very important meeting over Zoom. I'm a former ambassador at the Foreign Service of Israel. I know Assaf for many years from my time in Berlin, and other colleagues who are not present via their videos. But nevertheless, my question is very short. How will the old composition of the European Parliament influence the relations of the European Union with China?
Okay. We are throwing us out of our the map that we've mapped, the geographical map, which is, I think, an important question in the multipolar, polycrisis world. So China is definitely an important pole to take. Is there anyone else that wants to ask a question and we can pull that together? Or should we go? So yeah, Rina, Matthijs, Assaf, who wants to pick that first?
Sure.
Rina, please.
Yeah, I remember not a long while ago, one of the French government speakers was asked about about the war, the trade war with the European trade war with China, and then he said, stop. We don't have a trade war with China. And I think the Europeans have gone through a sort of a process, on the one hand being quite aggressive against Chinese trade aggressivity, but then also trying their best to keep the dialogue on, and a little bit like with Russia. I think the new parliament, which is more to the right, would be very careful not to enter into too many conflicts. A lot will depend also on the elections in the US and where exactly the European Union would like to position itself if and when the administration changes. And we know very well that the changes of administration in the US would mean also great changes vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis China. So I think the European Union will wait also for that to see where they position themselves. But absolutely, I think the far right parties, the way they don't want to enter into a conflict with Russia, they don't want to enter into a conflict with China.
Thank you, Rina. Matthijs?
Yeah, I can try. I would say that the results of the election point to the fact that economy matters very much to the European electorate right now. And Ilan, I know that you know the situation in Germany, that most of the political landscape is basically an economic landscape. People vote out of economic reasons, not so much political. And I think the need in Europe, the dependence in Europe in China is so big, whether it's the car industry in Germany or whether it's the luxury industry of France, that good relations with China, good trade relations with China is a kind of recipe for economic health for Europe. And I would imagine that this would come on top of every other ideological item on the agenda, whether it's pollution in China, or whether it's relations with Russia, or whether it's something else.
Human rights. Yeah, Matti, would you want to, or do you want to move on?
I just one comment. I'm not an expert on the China relations, but I think that when we look at the more right-wing parties, often there is a very strong element also of social justice and protecting citizens and those kind of elements. So I wouldn't be surprised if that also develops into a high level of protectionism, which could not be a smart choice from an economic perspective. But right now, China is trying to flood the European market with electric cars, and more voices are being heard that say that we have to put enormous amount of taxes on those cars to kind of make them less attractive. And I could imagine that those new parties would definitely support those kind of policies. The new meaning bigger right-wing parties.
Yeah, that's interesting because in the middle of the 80s, when the EU was losing the economic competition to Japan and the United States, they actually went to more integration, but not to protectionism. And now, when integration is not completely perfect in the EU, there's a lot of work to be done on services, etc. The trend is actually for protectionism. But we are also living in a bit different world. So we have another question from Daniel Rosenberg, and I'll add another one afterwards. Daniel, please present yourself.
Hello, my name is Daniel. I'm the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Jerusalem. My question regarding the role of the Executive Vice President. It's a new role that's been inaugurated, I think, in 2019. And it seems to decentralize the power of the Commission to some extent. And I was wondering, there has been very little talk about this since the election, but it seems to be quite an interesting issue. So I was wondering if there are any names or any comments that should be made about this.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Will Matti think about this question? I think it's more for you. Lena, please ask your question also and present yourself. Lena Zeiger, would you like to add another question? We'll take a few, and then this will be the last round. Okay, I don't know if Lena hears me. So Lena, if you want to jump in, yeah, please.
Yeah.
No, you're muted now. Yeah. Please unmute you. Lena, you unmuted yourself.
I'm trying to unmute. Do you hear me now?
No, yes, we hear you now. Please.
Okay, apologies. Lena Zeiger, I'm the Minister of Economy and Industry, Foreign Trade Administration. I was wondering, you talked a bit about the policies. It was very interesting about China. In terms of policies, well, the one big thing of the previous kind of commission was the green transition. And I think around that, it was mentioned a bit, and I think the direction is, the potential of this is pretty obvious. I was wondering about the digital agenda and the kind of the economic, I mean, the competitiveness vis-a-vis kind of the norms of privacy, et cetera, and the American companies. And we've seen quite a few developments over the recent years in the EU in terms of regulation. In the digital sphere, I wonder if you see that, like with the new parliament, do you think there would be different, more difficult, I don't know, consensus-making process, or how do you see it?
Okay, thank you. I don't know who wants to take that, Assaf or someone else. I will add in a third question. With that, we'll wrap up. It wasn't the theme of the webinar, but still, Jews in Europe. If you have any points to take with the rise of the extreme right, be it collaboration against the new anti-Semitism, or is it good or bad? Where is it good? Where is it bad? So please, we have those three questions. Who would like to start?
I can take the last question.
Please. Yes, please.
I'll take the last question about the anti-Semitism in Europe. And this, I go back to the misconceptions in Israel about the European far right, because in France, but also in other communities across Europe, the Jewish leaders have always been very, very clear against any contact or connection with the far right parties. No exception. And if you look back, for instance, the big dinner that the CRIF, the umbrella Jewish organization in France, is holding every year, they never invite neither Marine Le Pen, nor Eric Zemmour, nor Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So no extreme left, no extreme right. And in that respect, I think it would be, at the end of the day, it would be also a moral decision in Israel. If the Israeli government perceives these parties as beneficial and supportive of Israel, should that be more important than the line that the Jewish leaders in Europe are espousing, and that is to reject any party, first of all, parties that have relations or have origins in anti-Semitic groups or organizations on the one hand, but also against any parties that are promoting hate, would it be against Jews, but also against Muslims. So this is a very important note here, and it brings us also to when we look at the far right, but also the far left, in Europe, and it's true that they didn't do it all that well as the far right in the last elections. But we do see this phenomena of the extremes, that the extremes are coming more and more to the front of the political scene. This is something very worrying for Jews in Europe on both sides of the political map.
Thank you, Rina. Assaf, maybe you'd like to address, and then Matti will go to you.
Yeah, maybe about the digitalization. I see it continuing. I had a chance to interview Moderator from Denmark, and the thing is that all of these companies are American, or 90% of these companies are American, and therefore the EU has no problem in developing policies that will tax them or create limitations, and there's no in-house opposition. And I think the EU has put itself in the front of fighting social networks, of being fair competition, and so on. And I think the election to the parliament, because they didn't put any, I don't know, pro-American force in, would not change so much this position. About the the helpfulness of this policy, I think Days will say, I don't know if it's proving itself so much, but I imagine it will continue. It's a big part of what the Commission is doing, and many things are happening already and planned and so on. So that's my take on that. On the situation of Jews in Europe, of course, it's horrendous. I mean, just today I was reporting about 2 Israeli restaurants in Berlin that had to close down because one had graffiti against them. Another one said that there's not enough Jewish people coming because they're afraid to be seen in a place where other Jews are. It's a kosher restaurant. And another one had Free Gaza or Free Palestine engraved into its tables. And they have to move, and they have to go next to a synagogue to enjoy the police protection, because in Germany, every Jewish organization, every Jewish point has a police protection. So yeah, of course, the situation is much worse than it was 8 months ago from both sides, both the anti-Israeli Islamic side, both the progressive left.
That link between Israel and the Jews is very strong, I would say. Matti, we'll close with you, please.
Yes. So regarding the role of first executive vice president, I think it will really depend on the negotiations that will go on in the next month, and how the portfolios of all the commissioners will be distributed all over the 27 member states. And this is often a big political discussion between member states, between political parties, about who gets which title and which part of the portfolio of the work of the European Commission. Obviously, the executive vice presidents, they held very big portfolio, like the Green Deals, like the Green Deal and other very big European legislative files. So I wouldn't exclude to see that kind of structure again in the next 5 years, but I think that's part of the negotiation and part of how the jobs in Brussels will be distributed between the parties and the countries.
Thank you, Matti. So the EU bubble, we'll have to wait and see how the EU bubble now gets those new heads of different senior positions. That will definitely have an impact on how policies coming from Brussels will be shaped. And also the nomination of the new High Representative definitely will have an effect on the war in Gaza and on EU-Israeli relations. So I learned a lot from this Zoom. So thank you so much for our wonderful speakers. And thank you all for the audience for your participation and for your good questions. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much.